Hello friends and welcome back. In this lecture we will create a client class in Java. And here is the UML diagram for the class. The class is called the client and it has a private integer ID. We also have a private string name and a private string phone. And we have a private array list of account which is called accounts. Over here you can use an array list or you can use an array, no problem. Now let's have a look at the methods. We have a constructor which takes an integer and two strings. So the integer is the value for the ID, the first string is the value for the name, and the last string is the value for the phone, alright? As you can see, the constructor doesn't receive a value for the accounts. So the array or the array list of accounts is not going to be filled inside the constructor. So have a look over here. We have a method that is called addAccount and it receives an account as a parameter. So inside this method, we want to add this account that is passed as a parameter to the accounts array or array list. And have a look over here, we return a boolean. If you use an array, you have to make sure that we can add the account to the array. Because if the array is full, we cannot add more accounts, right? So if the array is full, we will return false, but if it is not full, we will return true, because we are able to add the account to the array. In my case, I'm going to use an array list, so I will always return true, because as you know, the size of the array list grows as we need. We also have a remove account method, and it takes the account ID as a parameter. So previously we created the account class and each account has an ID. So over here we are taking an account ID as a parameter and we want to remove the account with this ID from the accounts array or array list. So we have to iterate over our accounts and when we find the account with this ID over here, we want to remove it. And as you can see, we return a boolean. So if we found an account with this ID and removed it, we will return true. But if we didn't find an account with this ID, we will return false. Meaning that an account with this ID doesn't exist in our accounts array or array list. And over here we are going to create a method that is called toString and it returns a string. Inside this method we will return a string representation for our object. So for example, we can return the ID concatenated with the name, concatenated with the phone, and also we will concatenate this with a string representation for our accounts. And finally, we want all the getters and setters. So pause the video and try to implement this class. So let's go to IntelliJ. So as you can see, I'm inside IntelliJ and we want to create a new class. So go to our package, right click, go to new Java class. This class is called the client. Press enter and this is the class. Let me close this and let's get started. We will start with the attributes. So we have a private integer ID, we have a private string name, and also we have a private string phone. And finally, we want an array list of accounts. So the type is an array list. If you press enter, the array list class will be imported over here. In angle brackets, we will say that the elements inside the array list are of type account. This is the class that we created before. So press enter and this is the type for our array list. Now, this array list is called accounts. Now let's create the constructor. It is a public method that is called the client and it takes three parameters: an integer ID, a string name, and a string phone. Inside this constructor, we will assign each attribute to its value. So this.id is equal to ID, this.name is equal to name, and finally this.phone is equal to phone. And this is it. But what about the accounts array list? When we declare the array list over here, it is equal to null, right? So inside our constructor, we are going to instantiate it. So over here, I will say that the accounts object is equal to a new array list, like this. Notice that we don't have to respecify the type inside these brackets over here, because we already specified the type when we declared the array list over here, alright? Now we are finished creating our constructor. Now let's create the addAccount method. So it is a public method that returns a boolean. It is called addAccount, like this, and it takes an account as a parameter. Let's call it account for example. Inside this method, we want to add the account to the array list. So we'll say accounts, and this is our array list. Then we will use the add method. And over here we will pass the account as a parameter. So this statement will add the account that we got as a parameter to the array list. Now, in case of using an array list, I will always return true, meaning that we added the account to the array list. Now let me tell you this. If we didn't instantiate the accounts array list over here, then we will get an error when we try to call the add method. Because if we didn't instantiate the array list, then this variable over here will contain null. So we are trying to use the dot operator on an object that is equal to null, so we'll get an error. As I said before using the dot operator, we must instantiate the object. Now let's create the remove account method. So it is a public method and it returns a boolean and it is called remove account. We will receive the ID of the account as a parameter. So the ID of the account is an integer. We created the account class in the previous video. So over here we have int account ID. Now inside this method, we want to iterate over our array list and we want to search for the account with this ID over here. If we find this account, we will remove it and we will return true. But if we didn't find an account with this ID, we will return false. So let's get started. In this case, I'm going to use a for each loop. So let's say for account inside the accounts array list, I want to see if the ID of the account, so account.getID, is equal to the ID that we have as a parameter. If this condition is true, then this account over here is the account that we want to remove. So inside this if statement, let's get our array list. So it is accounts and we will use the remove method. As we saw before, the remove method can take an object and it will remove the object from the array list. So let's call the remove method and let's give it the account as a parameter. So we are iterating over our array list. If we find the account, we will remove it. Now, if we remove the account, we don't need to keep iterating over the array list. So we are supposing that each account has a unique ID. So let's modify this code a little bit. I will add a block of code to the if statement. We will remove the account and then we will break out of the loop because we are done. But now outside the loop, we need to know if we want to return true or we want to return false. So we need to declare some kind of a variable that will tell us if we remove the account or not. But there is another way. Inside the if statement, instead of breaking outside of the loop, let's return true because we removed the account. Now, if we reach this point outside the for loop, this means that we didn't find the account. So this condition over here was always false and the return true was not executed. So we reached this point. So over here we can return false, meaning that we didn't find the account with the specified ID. Now, let's implement the toString method. So down here, it is a public method that returns a string and it is called toString. It takes no parameters and inside it, we want to return a string representation for our client. So let me create a string which is called as, and initially it is equal to this.id concatenated with, let's concatenate the name, so this.name, and after that we will concatenate the phone, like this. Now after this information, we want to concatenate information about all the accounts of this client. So after the phone, I'm going to concatenate \n. So now everything we concatenate after the \n will be displayed on a new line, alright? So now over here, we want to write some code in order to concatenate each account to the string s. But before doing that, let's go to the account class and write a toString method. So let's go over here. This is our account class. And let's write a toString method down here. So it is a public method. It returns a string and let's call it toString. And inside here, we want to return some information about the account. So over here, we will return this.id concatenated with this.balance. And after that, let's concatenate the annual interest rate. So this.annual interest rate. And finally, let's concatenate the date. So this.date created, like this. Now let's go back to our client class. And over here, let's iterate over the accounts array list. So let's use a for each loop. So for account, let's call it account inside accounts. Each time we want to concatenate to the string as a string representation for the account that we have over here. So we will add to us account.toString, like this. This is why we implemented the toString method for the account. So instead of writing this code over here, we implemented a toString method inside the account class and we used it over here. So now we are iterating over all the accounts and we are concatenating a string representation for each account to the variable s. But we are not done yet. Let me go over here and I want to concatenate a \n also. So after concatenating a string representation for the first account, for example, we will get to a new line and then we will re-execute the loop. So on a new line, we will concatenate a string representation for the second account and so on. Now finally, let's return this variable s. Now before we continue, let me go up here. And of course, this attribute should be a private attribute. So let's add the private keyword. Now we still have the getters and setters. So down here, let's press Alt and Insert, go to getter and setter. And I want to generate getters and setters for the ID, the name and the phone. I don't want to create a getter and a setter for the accounts array list. I don't want to create a getter because I don't want whoever uses the class to be able to get a reference to the array list. If he gets a reference to the array list, then he can do whatever he wants with the array list. He can use the dot operator and execute any method that he wants. But we don't want that. we want whoever uses the class to only be able to use the add account and remove account methods, alright? Also, we don't want to create a setter because we don't want whoever uses the class to change the value of the accounts attribute, okay? So here are our getters and setters created. In the next video, we will write a program and try our client class. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.